So nice to finally meet you, Spider-Man.
Hi everyone, it's Charlie. This is going to be my non-spoilery Spider-Man Far From Home review, so I'll try to talk about as much as possible without getting into spoilers. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the Marvel videos. We're still doing that IMAX ticket giveaway too. All you have to do to enter is be a subscriber and leave a Spider-Man comment on the video. The movie itself was intended to be the bookend for Marvel Phase 3, even though technically it's supposed to be the first Marvel Phase 4 film. Kevin Feige just reiterated that there was so much stuff, so much baggage that Spider-Man himself in the MCU had to deal with, that this movie has the unenviable task of following the biggest Marvel movie that you've ever seen, Avengers Endgame. But a really helpful comparison to make would be Spider-Man 2 from Tobey Maguire era and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So even though it's a Spider-Man sequel and it's expected to up the stakes in a big way, it does sidestep a lot of the classic landmines that the franchise has had in the last two iterations. Usually what that means is they do way too much, way too fast. So with that in mind, they did a really good job of balancing the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, the very grounded way that they told Far From Home, like I'm just trying to deal with small-time problems, not really big Avengers level stuff. He just got back from his big Avengers field trip, watching his hero die right in front of him.
I
There's no way that you're going to top stuff like that, but they do manage to up the Spider-Man stakes to a much more worldwide, big, epic scale that you would expect to, without taking it too far, while still making him feel like he's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but he just has much, much bigger problems to deal with by the end of the film. It's really all about him dealing with the idea of superhero identity. Who is he going to become? The trailers did a pretty good job of spelling out the stakes, and yes, there were a lot of scenes from the trailers that did not wind up in the movie, so I'll address that at the end of the video without getting into really big spoilers. But the specter of Iron Man looms large in the film. Who is going to be the next Iron Man? So the film trades heavily on Iron Man's legacy. He's hugely important to the plot of the film for a character who died before the beginning of the story. So some might feel like he casts a shadow that's a little too large and kind of overpowers the Spider-Man story at times. But they do a good job of showing you the PTSD that Spider-Man is trying to deal with through Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and just trying to figure out what he's going to be doing next with his life. Because even though he was a sophomore during Spider-Man Homecoming and the snap happened, 5 years have gone by, they didn't age, so they all have to go to school in the next year. It's not like they're going to skip a whole bunch of years of school. They do address all your timeline questions for all these kids on this big class field trip within the first 5-10 minutes of the film. It's a pretty easy explainer. But while you and Spider-Man might still be completely traumatized by the end of Avengers Endgame, and even though Spider-Man films in general are about making Spider-Man suffer as much as possible, the film doesn't get too depressing with it, and even though you've seen Tom Holland crying his eyes out through the trailers, he doesn't take it to Tobey Maguire levels of bummed out Spider-Man. There's a real fine line you walk with stuff like that, and I think that Tom Holland has benefited from just being around some of these really high caliber actors like Robert Downey Jr., who's been kind of a mentor and surrogate father figure to him in real life ever since Captain America Civil War. You'll probably hear some comparisons to some really big seminal comic book moments from Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man 2, so even though the actual story of the film is very different, they do trade on some similar moments without completely retreading everything.
Am I not supposed to have what I want? What I need?
So some things will feel very familiar for longtime Spider-Man fans, whether you like that or you don't like that. That's part of the idea, I think, of a lot of comic book films, because comic books are a nostalgia medium. Show me the things that I love, but in a completely fresh and different way. So this film does trade on some very familiar classic Spider-Man moments. Some of you might be frustrated with some of the things the film does not do in rushing to set up a billion other sequels. It's pretty clear from the story that Kevin Feige is in no rush to take Spider-Man to the nth degree. It does take it to a pretty epic scale, but not in the way that you would expect it given what they did with previous Spider-Man franchises. So it does try to sidestep some of the landmines of Spider-Man 3 from Tobey Maguire era and Amazing Spider-Man 2 from Andrew Garfield era. And that those films just tried to open the door on Spider-Man villains and just stuff as many as possible in the films. So couch your expectations in terms of where the franchise is going. I know there have been a lot of rumors. I'll mention that at the end of the video. There's always a lot of rumors about where the franchise is headed in the future and Sony's plans for the next 10 years. They do have really big plans for the Spider-Man character, but Sony controls about 900 characters because they own the rights to Spider-Man. So even though Spider-Man Far From Home is sort of the last film before Marvel Phase 4 and it has to wrap all of these things up, it does do a good job of being a very self-contained story, so it won't completely ruin your enjoyment if you haven't seen every other Marvel film. But if you are a longtime hardcore comic book fan, they do trade on a lot of very classic Mysterio from his very first appearance in the Amazing Spider-Man comics. So as a character, I never thought that Mysterio would have worked in a film. Like, he just seems really silly with the fishbowl helmet, but they totally made it work, and I think a lot of that credit goes to Jake Gyllenhaal and his performance.
This is Mr. Beck.
You're Mysterio.
Cool name.
He's like Iron Man and Thor rolled into one.
Famous story about how he almost became Spider-Man during the Tobey Maguire era when Tobey got into a standoff with the studio to renegotiate for more money. There was a very brief second. It didn't end up happening. Obviously, we got Tobey Maguire, and the film wound up being one of the best comic book films of all time, and it still is. As cool as some of the things that they do with the Mysterio character during the film, I just feel like it wouldn't have completely worked had it not been Jake Gyllenhaal. So all credit goes to Kevin Feige and the Marvel producers for picking Jake Gyllenhaal. Obviously, there's like a stable of really high caliber actors they're trying to get. You probably heard recently about how the Eternals movie that they're getting ready to shoot is trying to cast all these really huge A-list actors like Keanu Reeves, Angelina Jolie, now Salma Hayek.
You're breathtaking. You're all breathtaking.
The rest of the supporting cast was great as part of the more friendly neighborhood Spider-Man high school storyline that they have running through. Obviously, you have the really big Mysterio stuff that's happening. That's the big epic scale of the film. Then you have all the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man Peter just trying to be a high school kid part of the story. Even though the film takes a little while to get going, the supporting cast was great. Nick Fury, it should go without saying, Samuel L. Jackson is fantastic. There are some really complicated things that are going on with his character during the film, so be sure to pay attention to what he's doing and to what Mysterio is doing. It will definitely reward you when you go see the film a second time, just because even though both the characters have very different storylines, they have this really weird layered approach to their characters in this film that are different from previous films. In the case of Samuel L. Jackson, we've never seen Mysterio before, but if you've ever watched Jake Gyllenhaal in some of his other more recent films, he's known for playing really complex characters, so you would not be wrong if you thought that there was something weird about the way some of his lines are delivered in the trailers. So yes, there are a lot of misleading things during the trailers. There was a really big montage that was supposed to happen at the beginning of the film that they just completely cut out. So there's a giant chunk of the trailers that you won't see until the Blu-ray comes out. They did say they completely shot it, they just cut it out at the last minute. They'll put it on the Blu-ray as part of the deleted scenes. If you're not a big Spider-Man or Tom Holland fan, or if you hated the franchise before this movie isn't going to completely blow you away, but it is better than Spider-Man Homecoming, and the franchise is getting a lot closer to a really solid third film. We never really got the chance with Andrew Garfield's Amazing Spider-Man franchise, but because Sony has been talking about live-action Spider-Verse at some point in the next 10 years, it's always possible they could address some of those hanging plot threads from those different franchises, including Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man franchise, just depending on how things go in the next 5 to 7 years.
Tom, can you tell us about the Spider-Verse?
Honestly, mate, I'm sick of this Spider-Verse stuff, right? I'm the only Spider-Man. It's me. Only one. There ever is and ever will. Greg!
Sorry.
Even though I spend a lot of time following these Marvel films, there were a couple big surprises for me in what they did with the ending. Once you see it though, you'll have a much better idea for how they're going to be pacing out the third film in the franchise and potentially future films after that. I know there are a lot of rumors about Sony planning for a bunch of sequel trilogies, including Tom Holland. They haven't revealed their official plans for more Spider-Man films after Spider-Man 3, but I do assume that Tom Holland will re-sign his contract and will continue to play the character for at least the next several years. But just remember that I said that Kevin Feige seems like he's in no rush to take Spider-Man to the nth degree, sidestepping a lot of escalation landmines from previous Spider-Man franchises. That'll make a little more sense once you see the film and you see what it is that they do at the end, but they do give you enough to go on with the ending to give you an idea for where Spider-Man 3 is going to pick up and what his problems are going to be during that film. This is the second time that I've seen the film, so I will say Spider-Man Far From Home, definitely a top 3 Spider-Man film, but I wouldn't say that it's better than Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse or Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man 2, which still stands as my favorite Spider-Man film of all time, still one of my favorite comic book films of all time, but it's still one of the best Spider-Man films so far. So it still manages to be great despite some of the minor issues that I have with it and the idea that it has to follow Avengers Endgame. No film ever wants to follow something like Avengers Endgame, but somehow Spider-Man Far From Home manages to pull it off. Zendaya did a pretty good job with the MJ character, but your mileage will vary on the teenage romance subplot. They do trade heavily on that because they're trying to develop the classic MJ Spider-Man romance, but in a very different way than you've seen it in previous films. There's a lot of really technical questions you'll probably have about specific things, Spider-Man making certain Spider-Man gadgets that I'll address when we get to my spoiler review. That'll post after the film comes out in the United States next week. I'll do a post-credit scene video. There are two post-credit scenes. There's a mid-credits and an actual post-credits. They're very important, so make sure you stay after the credits. Longtime Spider-Man fans will love them. Some of you will just be really excited by them, but they are very, very important for the future of the franchise and the future of the MCU. So as long as you have alerts enabled for my channel, you'll see those other Spider-Man videos post next week. I've got a Black Widow Taskmaster video that'll probably post later today, so just look out for that. But once you have a chance to see the movie, just leave your non-spoilery reactions in the comments, just because this video is supposed to be a non-spoilery one. I'll name a giveaway winner when I post that Taskmaster video later today. While you wait for everything, click here for that last big Spider-Man Far From Home trailer, and click here to learn about what Kevin Feige said about how Spider-Man will cross over with Venom in future movies. Thank you so much for watching. Everybody stay awesome. I'll see you guys tonight.